The rain had been falling since noon. The kind that soaks through everything and leaves a person feeling heavier than they actually are. Daniel Hartwell pressed his palm flat against the restaurant window and watched the street outside blur into smears of headlight and puddle. Behind him, the birthday cake sat untouched white frosting, 2 candles, one for each decade of a life he barely recognized anymore. He had bought it himself from the grocery store 3 blocks over, carried it under his jacket through the rain, and now it looked slightly lopsided from where he had held it too tightly on the walk. He was 32 years old tonight. The restaurant was called Crestmore, and it was the kind of place that had cloth napkins folded into swans and a wine list the size of a paperback novel. Daniel had never eaten here before. He had chosen it precisely because he had never eaten here before, because some small, foolish part of him had decided that 32 deserved something different, something that didn't smell like the break room at Caldwell Construction, where he spent 10 hours a day hauling equipment and reading blueprints for other men to execute. He was a foreman now, which meant he was paid slightly more than the men he supervised, and was blamed slightly more quickly when anything went wrong. He was good at the work. He had learned to be good at it because goodness at things is the only reliable currency available to people who have had everything else taken from them. He had worn his good jacket. It was not actually a good jacket. It was simply the least worn of the 3 he owned. A dark navy wool blend he had bought at a consignment shop 2 winters ago. The rain had found its way through the shoulders almost immediately. The hostess had seated him at a small table near the kitchen, not the worst table in the room, but close. He had smiled at her anyway. She had not smiled back, but she had handed him a menu with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already made an assessment and moved on. He was accustomed to that particular species of invisibility. 10 years of being quietly removed from the rooms that once wanted you develops a certain tolerance for being overlooked. Now a waiter drifted past without stopping, and Daniel watched a couple 3 tables over receive their entrees with a kind of easy ceremony that made him feel like a trespasser. The woman laughed at something. Her laugh was bright and uncomplicated. The man refilled her water glass without being asked. Daniel turned back to his window. 32. He tested the number in his mind the way a person tests a bruise, not to heal it, just to know it's still there. He had a daughter he hadn't seen in 3 days because his shift schedule had shifted again. And his ex-wife, not the woman he was thinking about tonight, but the woman who had come after, the brief and collision-prone marriage that had produced nothing but legal fees and mutual exhaustion, had taken Lily to her mother's house in Harrisburg. He would see Lily on Sunday. He held on to Sunday the way sailors hold on to maps. But tonight, the cake. Tonight, the fancy restaurant. Tonight, some gesture toward himself that he couldn't quite articulate. He was studying the menu with the careful attention of a man calculating, when he became aware that he was being watched. She was sitting 3 tables away, beside a woman whose back was to him, a woman in a pale gray coat who was speaking in a low voice on a phone. The girl was perhaps 8 years old, with dark brown hair pulled back in a messy half-braid, and the kind of serious brown eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. She was holding a small stuffed bear against her chest, and she was staring at Daniel with an intensity that made him shift in his chair. He gave her a small smile. The apologetic, non-threatening kind that adults give children in public places. She didn't smile back. She just kept looking at him, and something in that look made the noise of the restaurant fall slightly away, as if the room had turned down its own volume. Daniel looked back at his menu, looked up again. She was still watching. The woman on the phone, her mother, presumably had turned slightly, still talking, one hand gesturing as she spoke. The girl set her stuffed bear carefully on the table. She slid off her chair. She walked toward him with the deliberate steadiness of a child who has decided something and will not be talked out of it. She stopped at the edge of his table. "Are you Daniel?" she asked. He set the menu down. "I am," he said. She studied his face for a moment, comparing it to something internal, some image she had been given or constructed. Then she leaned forward slightly, as if what she was about to say required proximity to be true. "My mom still cries over you," she whispered. "Every night." The room went completely quiet, though of course it hadn't. The couple laughed again. The kitchen rattled. Rain tapped the windows. But Daniel Hartwell sat very still at his small table with his lopsided birthday cake and felt the past 10 years shift beneath him like a floor that had always been hollow. Herr Name was Sophie. She told him this with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who had been taught that names are the first and most important thing you offer a stranger. She also told him that she was 8 3/4, that the bear's name was Admiral, and that her mom had said they were meeting a business contact for dinner, which Sophie had understood to mean someone boring, but had come anyway because the restaurant had a dessert menu with 4 kinds of chocolate cake. Daniel sat very still through all of this, afraid that if he moved, the moment would end. "What's your mom's name?" he asked. Though some part of him, a deep, sealed-off part that had survived on silence and endurance for a decade, already knew. "Olivia," Sophie said. "Olivia Marsh." Marsh. Her father's name. She hadn't married then, hadn't taken someone else's name. He looked past Sophie toward the woman in the gray coat, who was still on the phone, turned away, one hand pressed to the back of her neck the way she always used to hold herself when a conversation was going longer than she wanted it to. Daniel's chest did something it hadn't done in years. "How did you know my name?" he asked Sophie. The girl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "There's a photo," she said. "In Mom's work bag. Not the regular bag, the old one she keeps on the high shelf. I found it when I was looking for scissors." She paused. "You have different hair now." He almost laughed. He had different everything now. 10 years ago, Daniel Hartwell had been a systems architect at Meridian Technologies, not a famous company, not a household name, but a firm that worked on sensitive data infrastructure for mid-size financial institutions, and which paid its best engineers very well. He had been 22, and he had been brilliant at things that are difficult to explain at parties. He had also been in love with Olivia Marsh in the consuming, architecture-rearranging way that only happens when you are young enough to not yet know how rare it is. They had been together for 11 months when her father, Gregory Marsh, the company's founder and majority shareholder, had called Daniel into his office and presented him with a